The President of the United States, Joe Biden, has vowed to defend the Philippines and Japan, offering his staunch support to his Pacific allies. He's hosted their first Trilateral summit in Washington. China's growing military assertiveness in Asia topped the agenda. Our correspondent James Chater reports.
The Prime Minister of Japan.
In Washington this week, a rapturous reception for the US's Indo-Pacific allies. Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida became only his country's second leader to formally address the US Congress, issuing stern warnings about the threats posed by Beijing.
China's current external stance and military actions present unprecedented and the greatest strategic challenge.
Kishida's remarks came amid a flurry of diplomatic activity aimed at galvanizing Washington's Asian allies. Shortly after, a historic first-ever trilateral summit between the leaders of the US, Japan and the Philippines. The focus of that meeting, growing concerns in Manila and Tokyo about maritime disputes with Beijing. China in recent months has stepped up aggression against Philippine vessels in the South China Sea. At the summit, Washington's message to its two mutual defense treaty allies: we will stand by our promises.
And I want to be clear, the United States defense commitments to Japan and to the Philippines are ironclad. They're ironclad.
China has said the meeting stoked bloc confrontation, adding it was being smeared and attacked.
The US-Japan relationship should not harm other countries' interests nor undermine regional peace and stability.
Back in Washington, beneath the diplomatic fanfare, a sense of urgency. Big question marks hang over the coming US election and what a victory for former President Trump would mean for his country's commitments overseas. Japan's leader warned of Washington's waning support for Ukraine and its implications for Asia.
The leadership of the United States is indispensable. Without the presence of the United States, how long before the Indo-Pacific would face even harsher realities?
In his address, Kishida said the world was at a historic turning point. In the face of such challenges, these three leaders sought to cast a vision of unity, one that will ensure the Indo-Pacific security for years to come.
Let's go to our correspondent James Chater in Taiwan, which Beijing claims as part of its sovereign territory. What does this ironclad commitment actually entail?
Well, President Biden made very clear that these mutual defense treaties that exist, for example, with the Philippines, does extend to the type of maritime vessels which we've seen China targeting in the South China Sea over recent months. Now, this is not a new position for Washington. This is a position that's been held for a long time now. But what we can tell from the reiteration, the very strong reiteration that we saw from President Biden, is the importance, really, that they're attaching to this issue. It's important to point out that these mutual defense treaties that exist with the US and the Philippines and the US and Japan, they operate on a bilateral level. This is not an Asian-style NATO that we're seeing come into fruition here. But what Washington really is trying to do, especially with this trilateral summit, is bring its allies in the region even closer together. And we're seeing that, especially in the form of the relationship between Tokyo and Manila, currently negotiating what could be a reciprocal access agreement for militaries, their militaries, to be stationed on each other's territory.
OK, so closer ties, but what about bolstering defences against a potential Chinese incursion besides those bases you mentioned?
Well, Japan and the Philippines have, of course, been taking their own measures themselves. Japan has undertaken a drastic overhaul of its defense spending. For example, in the case of Taiwan, issuing and deploying more military units to southwestern islands, much closer to the Taiwanese mainland, just a few hundred kilometers away. We've also seen, for example, between the US and the Philippines, the US negotiating access to more military bases, especially, again, in that northern province of the Philippines, very close to Taiwan, but also with very important strategic implications for the Philippines' concerns in the South China Sea too.
Are there concerns that Biden's promises could disappear under a Trump presidency, for example?
Well, this is the question that's really hanging over all leaders in the Indo-Pacific this year. And I think what we saw in the summit here really was an effort on behalf of all these leaders to institutionalize, to deepen these connections and these partnerships to a level that makes it difficult, should former President Trump come into office again, to undo some of that progress. We saw this really feature heavily in Kishida's speech to the Congress, appealing to both sides of the aisle in the US establishment, for example, saying that the US was critical to global security, whether that's in Europe, whether that's in the Middle East, or whether that's in the Indo-Pacific. But crucially, he also said, quote, that the US should not be expected to do it all unaided and on your own. Of course, this is something that former President Trump has spoken about frequently, that the US's allies haven't been doing enough to guarantee their own security. And so what we saw here from Kishida really was an effort to appeal to both sides of the aisle and to ensure that goodwill that currently exists between all three of these countries will last beyond November's election.
Asian security alliances and the US and China. James, thanks for the analysis. A deep dive now with Stephen Negi, a professor of politics and global studies at the International Christian University in Tokyo. How much support is there in the region for a greater US presence, first of all?
Thanks, Ben, for having me. By and large, what we see is that whether it's Southeast Asia, South Korea, or other parts of the Indo-Pacific, there is a large degree of support for more U.S. engagement within the region at the security level, diplomatic level, and economic level. In fact, most of the partners within the region would like to see the United States return to the CPTPP to anchor them in the region, but also devote more of their diplomatic resources to the region to deal with some of the challenges that the region's facing.
But it's not going to go as far as becoming an Asian-style NATO, as some people have been calling it?
No, the region's too heterogeneous to establish an Asian-style NATO. And what we're seeing in lieu of an Asian-style NATO is a series of mini-lateral relationships, these problem-solving ad hoc relationships that deal with specific issues within the region. We've seen this with the Philippines, Australia, Japan, and the United States in terms of the Maritime Cooperative Activities Initiative that will deal with challenges in the South China Sea. But we've also seen this with the Camp David principles between South Korea, Japan, and the United States to deal with issues in the Korean Peninsula. It's a mini-lateral approach to problem solving within the region that's going to move forward rather than a NATO.
Stephen, is that because everyone's tiptoeing around China, which is actually painting this as provocative?
Well, I think most of the countries within the region do see China as a revisionist power, that it's assertive in the South China Sea, across the Taiwan Straits and the East China Sea. But at the same time, their biggest trading partner is China. So how do they balance this important economic relationship that is the lifeline to the region's economy and, frankly, the globe's economy, with its assertive behavior that's highly disruptive, and as Prime Minister Kishida said in his speech to the Congress, has a fundamental, if it's successful in prosecuting its strategic interests within the region, will fundamentally disrupt the region's peace and stability.
But economically, China's becoming less and less dependent on its neighbours and the rest of the world, and is managing to do things on its own and lead the way. Where do you see all this then leading?
Well, at this stage, China's still the center of the global production network, its biggest trading partners are within the region. Just with Southeast Asia, it has $1 trillion of trade. With Japan, about $390 billion of trade. It's the biggest trading partner of South Korea and Australia. It's still a critical part of the region's economy. And even as it tries to recalibrate and recenter its economy away from these economies so it's more diversified, it's still dependent on these economies for consumption, for export, and I think importantly for technologies. And this is not going to change in the short term. 5, 10, 20 years, if the Chinese government's policies are successful, maybe it will be able to recalibrate this. But at this stage, I think most analysts like myself believe that decoupling by China or decoupling from China is really not likely or possible.
So in the short term, does China need containing?
I think that's an interesting question. I think what China does need to do is work with partners within the region and really work within the current rules-based order, or if it wants to renegotiate that rules-based order, work with countries through a consultative mechanism that creates new rules that are mutually agreed upon within the region. And at this stage, we haven't seen that. With regards to the UNCLOS agreement, that's the United Nations Clause of the Seas in the South China Sea, rather than obeying the agreement that China has signed, it's ignored it, and it's continued to expand its presence in the South China Sea, threatening the Philippines, Vietnam, and other claimants within the region. This has consequences. The South China Sea represents about 5.5 trillion US dollars of trade. Any kind of kinetic conflict within the region would obviously disrupt not only the region's economy, but the global economy.
Great talking to you, Stephen. Stephen Nagy, the International Christian University, Tokyo.
Thank you.